The night my father died, the house did not cry, the walls did not shake, and the city outside did not slow down even for a second. Yet something invisible cracked so deeply inside me that I knew nothing in my life would ever move in a straight line again. Because powerful men do not usually die quietly unless someone has decided that silence is the safest coffin. And my father was the kind of man whose name opened doors, closed mouths, and rewrote rules without ever leaving ink behind. So when the doctors said heart failure, and the lawyers said unfortunate timing, and the business partners said tragic loss, I watched their eyes instead of their words and realized they were all relieved. Which meant his death was not an ending but a release. And that realization was the hook that pulled me into a truth I was never meant to see. And before the story moves any further, let me ask you something, because this matters more than you think. Where are you watching this from right now, and what time is it there? Because the place and the hour you hear this story might decide which side of silence you believe in by the end. Now listen closely, because this did not start with my father's death but with a promise he made to our family years ago when he said everything he was building was for us, for protection, for legacy, for safety. Yet the house I grew up in was full of locked rooms and quiet dinners where my mother spoke less every year, and my younger sister learned early that asking questions could change the temperature of a room. And I learned something more dangerous, that survival sometimes meant pretending not to see the blood on the floor, as long as the carpet was expensive enough to hide it. My father ran a private logistics empire that officially moved goods across borders and unofficially moved influence through fear, debts, and carefully selected secrets. But none of that mattered to me until the week after his funeral, when I found my mother standing alone in his study, touching the spines of books he never read, staring at the desk where he signed papers that shaped lives. And for the first time in my life she looked at me not as her son but as someone she needed to tell the truth to before it crushed her. She did not cry, she did not whisper, she simply said, "Your father did not die of a heart attack. He died because someone finally collected a debt he thought time had erased." And then she handed me a thin envelope hidden behind a false drawer that smelled of old paper and fear. Inside were handwritten notes, dates, names, and one sentence, written again and again in different ink as if it haunted him. "Blood does not forget blood." That sentence followed me everywhere after that night. Because as I started reading the notes, I realized my father had not built his empire from nothing but from ashes that belonged to another family. A family he destroyed quietly years before I was born. A family whose name had been erased from records, properties transferred, accusations buried, and one child left alive by mistake or mercy. And that child was now a man, and that man was the one who arranged my father's death to look natural enough that no one dared to investigate. And as that truth settled in, I felt something cold replace my grief. Because grief mourns loss, but clarity demands action. Yet I did nothing, not because I was afraid, but because revenge is not loud when it is intelligent. It is patient, invisible, and polite. So I returned to my normal life. I took my place in the company as the grieving son. I shook hands with men who had smiled at my father's coffin, while calculating their next advantage. I listened more than I spoke, and I learned. I learned how the company really worked. How fear was disguised as loyalty, how silence was rewarded with comfort, how my father had controlled people not by threats but by knowing exactly what they could not afford to lose. And then I noticed something strange: files disappearing, accounts being quietly audited from outside firms, partners growing nervous because someone else was already inside the system, moving pieces without showing their hand. And I understood then that the man who killed my father was not done. He was not satisfied with death. He wanted collapse, and that meant my family was next. My mother sensed it too, not through documents but through instinct, sharpened by years of emotional survival. She told me one night that if the past came back to collect payment, she did not want my sister involved. And that was the moment I made a decision that changed the direction of every future breath I would take. I decided that if someone was going to finish this war, it would not be with guns or confessions but with ownership of the truth itself. So I began searching for the erased family, not through public records, because those had been cleaned, but through forgotten trails, old employees, former drivers, accountants who retired suddenly, and I found fragments: a burned warehouse fire ruled accidental, a woman who disappeared after testifying and was declared mentally unstable, a child placed in foster care under a different surname. And when I finally traced that child to a man living under a respected identity, with a clean business reputation and political protection, I understood the full shape of the irony. My father had created his own executioner by sparing a witness and teaching him how power actually works. And instead of confronting him, I did something far more dangerous. I watched him, I studied his methods, I learned his routines, his alliances, his weaknesses, and I realized he was repeating the same pattern my father once used, which meant he believed himself untouchable. And that belief is the most fragile thing in any powerful man, because it depends entirely on everyone else believing it too. So I began a quiet campaign of doubt, leaking nothing illegal, exposing nothing obvious, simply placing questions where certainty used to live. A delayed shipment here, a misfiled permit there, an anonymous compliance review that forced inspections, small enough to be ignored but frequent enough to create stress fractures. And as his world tightened, I watched my own family carefully, shielding my sister from knowledge, guiding my mother into financial independence under the excuse of restructuring, because revenge that costs innocent lives is not justice, it is laziness. And I refused to become a louder version of my father, yet every night I felt the weight of the truth pressing against my chest, because I was not just avenging my family, I was becoming the custodian of someone else's pain. And the closer I got to the man who killed my father, the more I realized that he was not a monster but a mirror, shaped by loss, sharpened by survival, and driven by a promise he made to himself as a child, standing in the ruins of his family. And that understanding did not stop me. It focused me, because stories like this do not end when someone dies. They end when the cycle breaks. And I knew the next move would decide whether this story became another buried truth or the last secret this family ever carried. As the pressure around him increased, I stayed invisible, because the moment a predator senses another predator, the game becomes noisy, and noise attracts consequences. So instead, I let time do what time does best. I let fear grow roots, and fear has a habit of forcing men to expose themselves, especially men who believe they have already won. And while he fought small fires inside his operations, I focused on something far more dangerous. The truth my father buried, because the notes my mother gave me were not just confessions. They were a map of crimes disguised as corporate decisions, land acquisitions masked as development projects, disappearances rewritten as resignations, and families reduced to footnotes through legal language sharp enough to cut bloodlines. And the more I read, the more I understood why my father never slept peacefully. Because empires built on stolen bones do not stand straight forever, they lean, and when they fall, they crush everyone nearby, including those who built them. So I began reconstructing the erased story piece by piece. I found the burned warehouse records altered after the fire. I found the police officer who signed the accidental ruling and now lived in quiet luxury, far beyond his salary. I found the accountant who falsified transfers and disappeared into early retirement under a different name. And none of them wanted redemption, they wanted protection, which meant they were willing to trade truth for silence. And I collected it all without revealing my purpose, because power does not come from exposing secrets. It comes from deciding when not to. Meanwhile, the man who killed my father began circling closer, not physically but strategically, buying minority stakes in companies connected to ours, influencing board members through favors that smelled clean but tasted rotten, slowly positioning himself, not as an enemy but as an inevitable solution. And the irony almost made me laugh, because this was exactly how my father once entered the lives of others before removing them entirely. Yet the closer he came, the more unstable he became, because uncertainty is expensive. And the small disruptions I planted started compounding. Suppliers demanded reassurances, partners delayed commitments, regulators requested clarifications, and each question reminded him that control is an illusion rented from silence, not owned. My mother noticed the change before anyone else. She told me one evening that the air felt heavy again, like it did years ago when my father was planning something irreversible, and that warning mattered, because it reminded me that obsession can turn purpose into blindness. So I slowed down. I watched my sister laugh at dinner without knowing the weight hanging above her future, and I promised myself that whatever ending this story had, it would not steal her innocence. Then something unexpected happened. The man reached out to me directly, not with threats or arrogance, but with sympathy. He invited me to dinner under the excuse of honoring my father's legacy, and that invitation was a test, because refusing would signal fear and accepting would signal ignorance. So I accepted with a smile that matched his own, and across a table set with expensive wine and rehearsed respect, he looked at me and said, "Your father was a complicated man, but he built something impressive." And I replied that complexity is just another word for consequences we do not want to explain. And in that moment, I saw recognition flash behind his eyes, because he realized I was not a grieving son wandering blindly through inherited power. I was something else, something familiar. And that realization unsettled him. He spoke about partnership, about stability, about protecting the future from the mistakes of the past. And every word was a bridge he wanted me to cross willingly. But bridges only matter when you know where they lead, and I already knew his destination. So I played along. I asked questions that made him feel intelligent. I listened in ways that made him feel safe. And I left with exactly what I needed, confirmation that he believed the story was ending in his favor. After that dinner, his moves became bolder, faster, sloppier, because confidence accelerates risk, and risk leaves fingerprints. I began feeding those fingerprints back into the system through channels that looked neutral. Independent audits, shareholder concerns, historical compliance reviews triggered by anonymous sources. All legal, all slow, all suffocating, until the day he made his first real mistake. He tried to force my sister into leverage. Not directly but indirectly. A scholarship offer tied to an institution he controlled, a subtle reminder that family connections can be useful or inconvenient, and that crossed a line he did not even know existed. Because revenge is personal but protection is sacred, and from that moment I stopped treating him as a mirror and started treating him as a threat. I accelerated the final phase, not with exposure but with alignment. I brought together the fragments of the erased family story and placed them carefully where they could not be ignored or dismissed as rumor. A journalist with a reputation for patience, a regulatory committee already under scrutiny, a political ally who needed redemption more than loyalty, and I did not give them conclusions. I gave them questions backed by documents that refused to stay buried. And as those questions surfaced publicly, the narrative shifted, because people do not fear villains as much as they fear uncertainty, and uncertainty began circling him like smoke. His allies distanced themselves quietly, his protections weakened subtly, and the same system he once used to erase others started erasing him. Contracts frozen, licenses delayed, investigations opened, all without my name attached, all without a single accusation spoken aloud. My mother watched the news without reacting, because she had lived long enough to know that justice rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as routine, and then one night she asked me if this would ever end, and I told her it would, when the truth no longer needed us to protect it. But even as I said that, I knew the most dangerous moment was approaching, because cornered men do not negotiate, they confess or they destroy. And the man chose destruction. He attempted to burn evidence by triggering a fire identical to the one that erased his family years ago, believing history would repeat itself obediently. But history only repeats when no one is watching, and this time everyone was. The fire exposed altered structures, hidden storage, falsified inventories, and what was meant to cleanse instead revealed. And when authorities finally moved, he tried to run, not physically but politically, calling in favors that suddenly cost more than they were worth. And as his world collapsed inward, he requested one final meeting with me, not to threaten but to understand. And sitting across from him again, I saw exhaustion where certainty once lived. He asked me why I did not expose him earlier, why I chose this slow unraveling instead of immediate destruction. And I told him, because my father destroyed your family loudly and believed silence would protect him, and you destroyed mine quietly believing time would forgive you. But truth does not care about volume or patience. It only waits for someone willing to carry it without becoming it. And in that moment something broke inside him, not with rage but with clarity, because he realized his revenge did not free him, it trapped him in the same story he tried to escape. And as he was taken away, I felt no victory, only release. Because revenge that ends cycles feels empty to those who expect satisfaction. But it feels peaceful to those who understand that some wars are won by refusing to pass the weapon forward. After his arrest, the world did not suddenly become quiet, because consequences echo longer than crimes. And while news channels framed the collapse as corporate scandal and political failure, I watched something far more subtle unfold inside my own family. My mother slept through the night for the first time in years. My sister stopped flinching when unknown numbers appeared on her phone. And the house felt lighter, as if it had been holding its breath since before I was born. Yet relief is dangerous when it tempts you to believe the story is over, because endings are rarely honest on their first attempt. And I knew that removing one man from the board did not dismantle the structure that allowed men like him and my father to exist. So I stayed alert, quietly reshaping what remained of the company. Not through force but through exposure to light, replacing fear-based loyalty with transparency that made corruption expensive instead of profitable. And that process brought resistance from those who had thrived in shadow, people who smiled while calculating survival paths, because power does not disappear, it migrates. And I had to decide whether I would chase it endlessly or change the environment so it could not survive. And during that transformation, I discovered something that unsettled me more than any threat. My father's empire had not only destroyed one family, it had intersected with many others in smaller, quieter ways. Suppliers crushed by impossible terms, competitors erased through whispered accusations, employees silenced by contracts designed to suffocate. And suddenly the story was no longer about revenge but about responsibility, because inheriting power means inheriting its damage, and pretending otherwise is just another form of denial. So I created a foundation disguised as corporate reform, offering settlements without forcing confessions, restoring properties through legal reconciliation, and funding independent oversight not controlled by our influence. And while some called it redemption theater, others understood it as survival evolution, because empires that refuse to adapt eventually become monuments to arrogance. Yet even as these changes took root, I felt the shadow of unfinished business, because the man who killed my father had been only one branch of a deeper network, and networks do not collapse from the loss of a single node, they reroute. And I began receiving subtle warnings, not threats but reminders, delayed approvals, anonymous tips suggesting my own activities would not survive scrutiny. And that was when I understood that by breaking the cycle, I had become inconvenient. And inconvenience is often punished under the disguise of procedure. So I prepared, not to fight but to endure, documenting every decision, decentralizing authority, ensuring no single action depended on my presence, because the safest power structure is one that does not collapse when its leader is removed. And as months passed, the attacks softened, not because I won, but because persistence outlasts intimidation. And eventually the story shifted again, away from scandal and toward something more uncomfortable for those who benefited from silence. Accountability without spectacle. And then, one night, my mother told me something she had never said before. She admitted she knew pieces of the truth long before my father died, not enough to stop him, but enough to fear him. And that confession changed how I saw her. Not as a passive victim, but as someone trapped between survival and morality. And it forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about myself. That my revenge had also been a way to forgive her without saying it out loud. Because anger is easier than understanding, and understanding requires vulnerability. And as our family healed slowly, honestly, without dramatic apologies or cinematic reconciliations, I realized that the real cost of power was not blood or money, but intimacy, the inability to be fully seen without fear. And that realization followed me when the final reckoning arrived unexpectedly. A sealed court document released through a routine transparency request revealed my father had not spared the child of the harassed family out of mercy, but out of calculation. He believed leaving one witness alive would validate his own restraint, a narrative he told himself to sleep at night, and reading that shattered the last illusion I held about him, because it meant his empire was not built on desperation but on ego, and ego is the most expensive currency of all, because it demands payment in lives. And for the first time I allowed myself to grieve, not just his death but the father I never had, the man I believed he was, and that grief freed me in ways revenge never could, because it allowed me to stop defining my future in opposition to his past. And when people asked why I did not take public credit for dismantling a corrupt system, I told them that stories centered on heroes create new villains, and the goal was not replacement but reduction, reducing harm, reducing fear, reducing the distance between power and accountability. And as years passed, the company became something unrecognizable from its origin, smaller, slower, but cleaner, and my sister built a life untouched by the legacy that once threatened to consume her. And my mother found peace not through absolution but through honesty. And sometimes, late at night, I revisit the study where this journey began, touching the desk where secrets once slept, and I think about how easily I could have chosen a different ending, one fueled by exposure and humiliation and personal satisfaction. But that path would have kept the cycle alive, feeding the same hunger that destroyed families before mine. And instead, I chose something quieter, something less cinematic, something harder to celebrate but easier to live with. And if you are still watching this story from wherever you are, and whatever time it is there, ask yourself this: if you had the chance to destroy the person who destroyed your family, would you choose victory or freedom? Because they are not the same. And the answer you give might decide which stories you pass on, and which ones finally end with you. Time did what revenge never could. It tested whether the changes I made were real or cosmetic, and that test arrived, disguised as opportunity. Because power does not only challenge you when it is threatened, it tempts you when it thinks you are tired. And 2 years after the collapse, a consortium approached me with an offer that would have restored everything my father once had: global reach, political insulation, financial dominance, all wrapped in language about stability and growth. And for a brief, dangerous moment, I understood how men like my father convince themselves they are necessary, because the offer came with promises of jobs saved, markets protected, families fed, and refusing it would mean uncertainty for thousands of people who depended on the company. And that is how compromise sneaks in, wearing the face of responsibility. Yet something felt wrong. Not loudly wrong, but quietly misaligned. So I slowed the process and started asking questions that were inconvenient. And as I pulled at those threads, I saw the familiar shape beneath the surface. Shell companies linked to the same networks that once protected my father, intermediaries who specialized in moral distance, contracts designed to shift blame upward and consequences downward. And I realized the cycle was not trying to rebuild itself violently, it was trying to seduce me, to make me believe I could control it this time. And that realization terrified me more than any threat ever had, because it meant the final enemy was not a man or a system but the part of me that understood how effective corruption could be. So I stepped back and did something my father never did. I shared the decision publicly with the board. I opened the offer to independent review. I invited criticism instead of suppressing it, and the backlash was immediate. Accusations of weakness, missed opportunity, betrayal of legacy, because transparency feels like instability to those who profit from opacity. And the pressure intensified. Media narratives shifted. Anonymous sources questioned my competence. Investors grew restless. And once again, I stood at the edge of a familiar abyss where fear could justify any choice. And during that chaos, my sister asked me a question that stripped the moment of all its complexity. She asked if I was happy. Not successful or respected, but happy. And I realized I had not asked myself that since the night my father died, because survival had replaced joy, and purpose had replaced peace. And that honesty clarified everything. I declined the offer, not dramatically, but decisively. And in doing so, I triggered the final resistance. Legal challenges appeared overnight, regulatory obstacles multiplied. Old allies resurfaced, demanding loyalty payments disguised as favors owed. And then came the final revelation that threatened to undo everything. Evidence surfaced suggesting my father had orchestrated his own downfall contingency, a network of documents designed to implicate me if certain conditions were met, a final act of control from beyond the grave. And reading those files, I understood how deeply he feared irrelevance, because even in death, he wanted to dictate the narrative. And for the first time, anger returned, sharp and tempting, because exposing his manipulation would destroy what remained of his reputation permanently. But it would also drag my family back into spectacle, reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. And that choice was harder than any revenge plan I ever executed, because it forced me to decide whether truth always needed an audience. And I chose restraint, not silence but containment. I secured the documents legally, disclosed their existence to the appropriate authorities without public release, and let the system absorb them without feeding the spectacle. And that decision marked the true end of his influence, because control starves when it is denied reaction. And slowly, the pressure receded, not because everyone agreed with me, but because exhaustion outlasts outrage. And in that quiet aftermath, something unexpected happened. People began approaching me not with fear or ambition, but with trust. Employees speaking openly about concerns, partners proposing collaborations rooted in mutual accountability, regulators engaging in dialogue instead of confrontation. And I realized that by refusing to play the old game, I had changed the rules subtly enough that resistance lost its script. And that was the moment I finally felt free, not victorious but unburdened. Because freedom is not the absence of enemies, it is the absence of fear shaping your choices. And as the years moved forward, the story of my father faded into history books and legal case studies, stripped of mythology, reduced to lessons. And I built a life that existed outside reaction, relationships based on honesty rather than leverage, success measured in stability rather than dominance. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had chosen differently at any point. If I had exposed everything publicly, if I had destroyed instead of dismantled, if I had embraced the power offered instead of refusing it. And those thoughts no longer disturb me, because the story ended the only way it could without repeating itself, quietly, with accountability replacing spectacle. And if you are still here watching this unfold from wherever you are in the world and whatever hour it is for you right now, remember this: revenge can feel like justice, but it often chains you to the past, while responsibility asks more of you but gives you something rarer in return. The chance to end a story instead of becoming its next chapter. The final shift did not arrive with applause or headlines, but with a quiet morning when I walked through the company offices and realized no one lowered their voice when I passed. No one paused conversations. No one waited to see my reaction before continuing their work. And that simple, ordinary normalcy told me more about success than any balance sheet ever could. Because fear had finally left the building, and with it, the legacy that once defined my family loosened its grip on my identity. Yet endings demand one last confrontation, not with enemies, but with memory. So I returned to the house where it all began, the study now empty, the false drawer removed, the desk stripped of its authority. And I sat there alone thinking about the boy I was before power shaped my spine into caution, before silence became a skill. And I realized that this story was never truly about revenge, but about inheritance, about what we accept without question and what we choose to transform. Because families do not only pass down names and assets, they pass down unfinished business, unspoken rules, and emotional debts that compound quietly across generations. And I had spent years believing that ending the cycle meant dismantling systems and exposing crimes. But the final piece was internal, forgiving myself for the satisfaction I once craved, for the moments I enjoyed watching a man unravel even when I knew it was necessary. Because acknowledging that truth did not weaken me, it made me honest. And honesty is the foundation that power fears most. As time moved on, the world forgot the details, as it always does. Scandals replaced by new scandals, villains replaced by louder villains, and that forgetting was not failure but success, because justice that endures does not need constant remembrance. It embeds itself into structure and behavior. And my family rebuilt itself not as a symbol of redemption but as something simpler. A unit that spoke openly, argued safely, and chose presence over performance. My sister grew into her own ambitions untouched by the shadow that once hovered over her future. My mother learned to speak without measuring the cost of each word, and I stepped back from leadership eventually, not because I was forced out, but because the system no longer needed me to hold it together, which was the greatest compliment it could offer. And in stepping away, I discovered something unexpected. Peace is not passive, it is active maintenance, a daily choice to resist shortcuts even when no one is watching. And sometimes late at night when the city is quiet, I think about the man who killed my father, not with anger but with clarity, understanding now that he was a product of the same machinery that produced my father. Different outcomes shaped by different moments, and that knowledge does not excuse his actions, but it explains the tragedy of repetition. Because when systems reward cruelty, they manufacture it endlessly, and breaking that pattern requires sacrifice that rarely feels heroic. It feels lonely, uncelebrated, and slow, and yet, it works. And if you stayed with this story until now, from wherever you are watching, and whatever time it is where you live, you did not do so because of explosions or dramatic twists. You stayed because something about this story felt real. Because at its core it reflects a choice many people face in quieter ways every day. Whether to repeat what hurt us or to end it. Whether to seek dominance or to choose dignity. And that is why this story matters. Not because it ends with punishment, but because it ends with responsibility. And as this chapter closes, I want to ask you something honestly. Did you expect revenge to feel different, louder, more satisfying? Or did this ending challenge what you believe justice looks like? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is there right now, and what part of this story stayed with you the most. And if this kind of deep cinematic storytelling that does not insult your intelligence meant something to you, then like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below, because stories like this only continue when people choose to engage with meaning rather than noise.